Hi, welcome back to the second episode of the American Merchant Marine. I'm Sal Mercogliano. This series is looking at the U.S. Merchant Marine on the 100th anniversary of the passage of the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, or the Jones Act. This past week, we have seen attacks on the Jones Act continue and the American Merchant Marine continue. The Grassroots Institute, which is an institute based out of Hawaii, is getting ready to release a study on how expensive the Jones Act is for Hawaii. Their argument is because Hawaii is under the requirement to use American built, American owned, American crewed, and American operated vessels, that it raises costs to live on an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The second one was a National Review article entitled Deep End of the Swamp, which again is another one of these attacks on the U.S. Merchant Marine. And I'm going to break down that article separately in another event. But just to highlight that article, one of the things that the author highlights is 32 out of 359 ships that were used in the first Persian Gulf War were commercial U.S. vessels. That's it. That's his statistic right there. 32 out of 359 ships. Only less than 10% of the ships used in the first Persian Gulf War came from the U.S. Merchant Marine. And that is categorically false. I know where he got that source. It's not his fault. GAO reports and other reports say this, but it's not true. I can tell you right now that 8 of the 13 maritime preposition ships were U.S. built, U.S. crewed, U.S., fit the requirements of the Jones Act. It doesn't include the tankers, all the tankers that were used to provide fuel during that period. It doesn't include the 7 large companies that were under the special Mideast shipping agreement that hauled 2,700 containers every week over to sustain military forces in 1990 and 91. And those were dozens of ships that were U.S. flagged vessels. And most importantly of all, fails to identify the issue that the large majority of the crews that manned the ready reserve vessels and the ships of the Fast Sealift Squadron came from the U.S. Merchant Marine, largely from the Jones Act. And there's only been 2 times we've tapped into the Jones Act to provide shipping. It was in World War I and World War II. And in both cases, we desperately needed them. Had they not been available, literally the course of world wars could have gone differently. But today, that's not what I want to talk about. Today, what I want to talk about is the state of the maritime industry around the world. One of the big fundamental issues, I think, that the Jones Act and the issue of the American Merchant Marine falls upon is this argument. People within the maritime industry talk to other people within the maritime industry. They talk well. They know each other. They tend to have gone to the same schools. It's a small little finite community. And even within that group, there's subsets. There was a meme out this earlier I saw of one side of a chart and list all the different types of ships there were. And it's somebody from the shipping industry, and they're pointing to all the different ones. And there's someone on the other side, and all it said was boats. And that's the fundamental flaw right now in the argument. Those in favor of the U.S. Merchant Marine tend to talk to those who agree with them, who are in the U.S. Merchant Marine or support the U.S. Merchant Marine. Those outside, those who are opposing changes that would literally end U.S. flag vessels in the coastal waters of the United States, are talking not to those people. Those people are not going to change. That's their industry. They know the importance of it, but they're talking to the general public. And what's happening right here is that the U.S. maritime industry is not talking to the general public, because when they do try to talk to the general public, they don't talk in a way that communicates what they want. It's jargon, it's volumes, it's a variety of things. And I'll give you a perfect example of this. This is a book entitled 90% of Everything by Rose George. The subtitle is Inside Shipping, the Invisible Industry That Puts Clothes on Your Back, Gas in Your Car, and Food on Your Plate. Everybody I know within the maritime industry hates this book. They don't like it. They think it is a poor kind of representation of what the maritime industry is. Yet everybody who's outside the maritime industry who loves this has the same reaction. I did not know that. I wish I would have known that. And my question is, why did someone in the maritime industry not write this book? Why are we not writing this book all the time? Why are we not conveying that? Because the opponents of the Jones Act, the opponents of the maritime industry, are lobbying all the time. And they're not lobbying to the maritime industry. They're lobbying to people who don't understand the maritime industry. And when they're the only facts out there, when they're the only ones talking, they're going to get their point across. So let's talk a little bit about the maritime industry today. Let's give a primer on what the maritime industry consists of today. So I have two recommendations for anyone who wants to understand what the maritime industry is. One of them is a yearly article that comes out in the U.S. Naval Institute proceedings every May. It's part of their annual review. Sashi Kumar, who used to be the provost at the United States Merchant Marine Academy, he's now an associate administrator at the Maritime Administration, every year writes the U.S. Merchant Marine and World Maritime Review. It is an article. Unfortunately, it's usually through a paywall, but sometimes you can access it through USNI proceedings and read it. And it is it is several pages, but it's a good summation of what is going on in the maritime industry today. It's handy, it's quick, it's informed, extremely well researched, and that's just who Sashi is. He is definitely a well versed person, probably one of the most knowledgeable people out there in the maritime industry. The other comes from the United Nations, specifically UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development. Every year since 1968, they publish what's called the Review of Maritime Transport. And the Review of Maritime Transport is a snapshot of the world shipping. It is now 51 years old. And matter of fact, last year, 2 years ago in 2018, they did a 50-year commemoration issue, which is really good. Really recommend that one. It's good. It's got some articles in there from leading authors. Extremely well done. But one of the things that document does is really capture what's going on in the maritime industry. And what is missing out there is context for why the maritime industry is so important. Why has there been such a fundamental change in cargo and transport over the years? I'll give you this simple statistic. So in World War One, there were 8,445 ships plying the world's oceans. That's on the eve of World War One. 8,445 ships. On the eve of World War II, 9,161 ships. Just a small of an increase. Ships got larger, ships got bigger, they were more economical. But ships are basically, that's that number. Today, over 92,000 vessels are registered over 100 gross tons in the world today. And it gives you an idea of the scope and scale of the increase in ocean transportation that's going out there. I'll give you another statistic that's pretty startling. In 1950 is really the earliest we have this. About a half a billion tons of cargo moved on the world's ocean. So 1950, half a billion tons of cargo. In 2018, we exceeded 11 billion tons. 11 billion tons. It's a 22-fold increase in the amount of goods that are moving across the world's oceans. And the question is, where are those goods moving? How are they flowing? What is moving? What are we talking about moving across the world's oceans? And it's important to have that identification of what's happening. I'll give you another statistic that's extremely important. Who are building the world's ships? 94% of the world's ships are built in 4 countries, and they're all located in the Far East: China, Korea, Japan, and the Philippines. If you remove those 4 countries, there is not another country on the planet that builds more than 1%. Everybody else is less than 1%. So most of the world's shipbuilding is concentrated in those areas, and the nation in particular that is concentrating and expanding is China. Over 40% of the world's shipbuilding is in China. To counter those two articles I mentioned before, one in National Review and the other one coming out by the Grassroots Institute, CSIS just published an article, which I think is very important, called Hidden Harbors. It talks about Chinese shipbuilding. And that report really demonstrates how China is dominating the shipbuilding industry, how China is really growing in scope and scale, and Chinese shipping lines also, we see that happening. So let's talk about how the maritime industry is structured and what are we talking about. So let's talk about the countries in maritime transport. Who are the big players that we're discussing here? So when you talk about registry, where the ships are registered, in other words, what flag do they fly? Now, ships have to be registered to sail on the world's oceans. And one of the things that happened post World War II was the proliferation of what's called flags of conveniences or open registries. Today, if you look at the world's oceans, there are 3 major flags of convenience out there. They control 41% of the world's shipping, and that is Panama, Liberia, and the Marshall Islands. And the irony of those 3 flags is they're all created by one country and one country only: the United States. The U.S. is the cause for really the proliferation of flags of convenience. And it's not because of cost or shipping, it has to do with many other reasons. Panama, for example, was really created and grew because of World War II. To get around neutrality acts to get aid to the British in World War II when we were neutral, uh, Franklin Delano Roosevelt went to several oil companies, Esso in particular, what is today Mobil Exxon, and asked them to reflag their ships to Panama because then they weren't under U.S. neutrality laws and they can haul 100 octane gas to England to fight in the Battle of Britain. Uh, After World War II, as the United States is working in the United Nations and we needed allies on our side, uh, a Secretary of State, Stenedis, basically went to the nation of Liberia and had an idea. We had a long relationship with Liberia going back to the American Colonization Society of the 1800s. And one of the things that was proposed was to create a ship registry in Liberia. And that would be an opportunity for the U.S. to be able to use Liberian flags for some vessels outside where you don't want a U.S. flag. And so the Liberian registry took off. Unrest in Liberia in the 1980s, 1990s created a lot of doubt about the Liberian registry, and there's a lot of questions about it, even though it's still around today. And you see the creation of the Marshall Island registry in that period of time. Marshall Islands was unique because it is a U.S. Commonwealth, a territory. And so there was a concept that, well, we'll still get the protection of the U.S. flag, but we'll be under this Marshall Islands flag. So they control about 41%. And that number fluctuates year to year. But if you want to go over 50%, the other nation you add in there is Hong Kong. And of course, Hong Kong's status today is nebulous because of what's going on in Hong Kong. If you look at ownership, who owns ships? Who are the three countries that own ships? And the three are Greece, Japan, and China. Greece is historically a long ship owning nation. We've seen that for a long time. Japan, too, after World War II, Japan had always been a major player in it. But China is the interesting one because unlike Greece and Japan, where the majority of that ownership is in foreign flags or open registries, over half of the Chinese registry is in Chinese flag. And if you take the Chinese registry, the Chinese flag vessels, and add it to Hong Kong, which looks like China's about ready to do, then China, those ships on the Chinese and Hong Kong registry become the second largest merchant marine in the world. And that's of significance. So if you look at the maritime industry today, it's broken down in really four segments. The review of maritime transport looks at three of these. The fourth one they don't look at is the passenger ship trade. There's a bit of snobbery among cargo carriers there. They tend not to see passenger ships and cruise lines as real ships, but that's a major industry out there. And so you have that, and we'll put that to the side. The other three areas that you really see transport is number one is in dry cargo, largely containers, containerization. Ever since the 1950s, the takeoff in containerization has been massive. Malcolm McLean, a truck driver from Maxton, North Carolina, uh, develops and really is the key innovator here in the introduction. And there's a lot of debate about who creates the container, but Malcolm McLean by far is the person acknowledged for this. And when the SSI DLX sails in the late 1950s, it opens up a world of change. His first container ship can carry 58 containers on board. Today, we're looking at 23,000 containers on some of these mega box ships. And this is a trend we've seen in the maritime industry, the expansion, the proliferation of mega ships. Today it's in container ships. We're seeing that being done. Mega container ships are great, but they can't do everything. They tend to go from major hubs, but they can't go in the smaller ports. And so what you need is feeder ships from them. But one of the things we're seeing in the container trade right now is the consolidation into large lines. There are roughly about 9 major shipping lines today that handle the vast majority of container cargo, almost 80% of the container cargo. And of those major lines, they're consolidated into 3 conferences. And so none of those conferences, by the way, are U.S. They're all overseas. And one of the biggest ones that's on the move and growing is Costco. Not the Costco you go into the box store, but this is the Chinese Overseas Shipping Company, which is really growing, challenging the 2 big ones, which is Maersk, which is a Danish company, and then also Mediterranean Shipping and CGM. Mediterranean Shipping is in Switzerland, and CGM is a French line. But you definitely see Costco nipping at their heels. Then you have the tanker industry. The tanker industry, which had for a long time been really the big carrier of cargo in the world. Uh, one of the things we saw was the growth of tankers into these massive VLCCs, very large crude carriers, and then ultra large crude carriers. And this is largely a result of the closing of the Suez Canal in the 1960s and 70s. So you had to go around Africa, and so they started building these large, massive VLCs, ULCCs. The problem is once the Suez Canal opens up, and more importantly, because of the nature of the tanker market, those large carriers really were not seen as being very economical. And then you have another issue where in the 1980s, the seven major shipping companies that control tankers, what were known as the Seven Sisters. These were the gas companies that got the oil out of the ground, they refined it, they shipped it, and then they had gas stations near you: Texaco, BP, Shell, Mobil, Exxon, all the kind of names you would know, divested themselves of their tanker fleet, and for a very good reason, because they started having accidents. And they came to realize having your name placarded on the side of a ship like the Exxon Valdez or the Amoco Cadiz was not a smart move. And so what they did is they put a middleman between them. So they basically created independent companies to haul oil. And so the oil company divested itself. Now, one of the things we're beginning to see, but is the oil companies again, not the oil companies themselves, but oil tanker companies are once again consolidating. We're seeing that consolidation begin to take place. But the place where we're seeing growth in massive areas is in the bulk trade. We're talking about ores and grain, any sort of dry material that you can fill into the hopper of a ship. Those vessels are growing in size and scale. Just to give you an example, the Vale ships, which come out of Brazil and haul iron ore and grain and all these bulk materials, will sail from Brazil around South Africa all the way to China. And the statistic that I always use, and the one I come up with, is this: out of the ships, 23% of the world's ships, this is that massive total I told you of 91,000 ships, 23% carry dry bulk. Those 23% of the vessels carry 71% of the total carrying capacity of that 11 billion tons. They carry 71% of that. And that dry bulk trade is really significant out there. And so understanding the nature of world maritime trade is extremely important, because if you don't understand world maritime trade, you don't understand how commerce is moving, then the argument about trade in the United States and an argument about the Jones Act, why the United States needs its coastal fleet to be American flagged, American owned, American built, and American operated. Because one of the things that we're seeing happen worldwide is this massive consolidation, the consolidations into these multinational corporations, which in some cases operate outside of national lines. But we're still seeing national lines exist, and particularly China. China is the one nation out there that is growing in its shipbuilding, it's growing in its registry, and it's growing in its carrying capacity. And more importantly, one of the things that we're seeing companies do out there is control and run companies out of business. Over the past few years, if you wanted to watch this happen, you watch the container trade, and you'd watch companies like Maersk or CGM or MSC go in and run a company out of business. They would just drop rates, and they would take a loss for a quarter or 2 quarters, to the point when another company couldn't do it. We saw that with Hanjin Marine in 2016. The seventh largest container liner in the world collapsed. Korea, there was a Korean shipping line, and all of a sudden the 96 ships of the Hanjin Marine line found themselves bankrupt, floating around on the world's oceans, and the vessels not coming to port for fear of being arrested. And when people talk about, hey, we need to increase competition, if you remove this American monopoly, you'll open competition. And yeah, you will, until one company wants to dominate that competition. They'll come in and lowball your costs and take over that trade route, but then you're in a fixed monopoly. And what tends to happen in a fixed monopoly isn't they don't charge you the lowest. They don't charge you a cent over what the minimum cost is. They're going to charge you as much as they can until another rival comes in. And we've seen that with the oil trade recently, and the spikes in fuel prices and the dumps in fuel prices. And that's what we potentially open ourselves up to. Again, I don't think the U.S. maritime industry is in a healthy position. I am the first one to admit that. But the solution is not to cut the appendage off, which is the U.S. Merchant Marine, and put our hands into multinational corporations and foreign nations that probably don't have our best interest at mind. If Hawaii then becomes dependent for its trade, for example, on Costco Shipping, a Chinese backed firm, or any other entity that's out there, they are outside the control of any really mechanisms of the United States. And in case of a peer-to-peer conflict like World War One, World War Two, the reason Hawaii sustained itself in World War Two is because Matson Line maintained that flow of goods to the Hawaiian Islands. The Hawaiian Islands were never isolated in World War Two. Even when Japanese submarines were sinking ships like Cynthia Olsen on the day of Pearl Harbor, uh, Matson ships, the Lurleen, the Matsonia, those vessels were still continuing the trade. And more importantly, we tapped into those vessels to win the peer-to-peer conflict that was World War One, World War Two, and we used those Jones Act vessels to pull crews off to fight in Vietnam, in Korea, in the first Persian Gulf War, in 2003 in Iraq. We used them time and time again. And so again, it's very easy to make this argument because people don't understand the context of international shipping. And one of the things that we need to do is educate those of you outside the shipping industry, what the shipping industry is, what's going on. And then those inside the shipping industry, you need to talk to people outside the shipping industry. And you need to do it in a way that you can convey the importance of shipping. Hope you enjoy this episode. Stay tuned. We'll have another episode coming next week. I'm Sal Mercogliano. Thank you.